Good evening, and thank you all so much for coming tonight. My name is Alexis Gerganius, and I'm the student president of the Buckley program. Before I introduce our esteemed guest, I would like to say a few words about the Buckley program. Tonight's event would not have been possible without the generous support of Carol Brown, the Irving Brown Lecture Series, and Young America's Foundation, so please join me in thanking them. The Buckley program is dedicated to the promotion of intellectual diversity on Yale's campus. We achieve this goal in a number of ways, including our speaker events, debates, annual conference, summer internships for Yale undergraduates, and various other activities. Undergraduates and graduate students interested in learning more about the Buckley program should visit our website, buckleyprogram.com. To learn more, new applications are due by Friday, October 6th. Our event tonight with Carly Fiorina is one of many great events this semester. And later in the semester, we will host firing line debates on Iran and Brexit, Professor Amy Wax, and our fall conference with keynote speaker, former Senator Kelly Ayotte. To find a more detailed schedule of events, please visit our website, buckleyprogram.com. Now to introduce our speaker. Carly Fiorina is a true leader and problem solver. She is a passionate, articulate advocate for policies that advance growth, entrepreneurship, innovation, and effective leadership. She started her career filing and answering phones as a secretary, then joining AT&T in an entry-level sales position. 15 years later, she led AT&T's spin-out of Lucent Technologies and then Lucent's North American operations. In 1999, she was recruited to Hewlett-Packard, where she would become the first woman to lead a Fortune 50 business and allow HP to survive the worst technology recession in 25 years. In her 6 years as chairman and CEO of Hewlett-Packard, HP not only survived the dot-com bust, but they became the leader in every market segment and every product category. As a result, HP grew from the 28th to the 11th largest company in the United States during her tenure. In 2010, she didn't shy away from a challenging run when she ran for U.S. Senate in California against Barbara Boxer. Against all odds, she earned more votes than any Republican nationwide in that election cycle and raised over $25 million in 12 months. In 2015, she announced she would seek the Republican nomination for President of the United States, capturing national attention for her platform of citizen government. She was credited for changing the landscape of the Republican field, winning debates, and fighting for conservative principles. Carly Fiorina has always believed in giving back to her community and has been an active participant in government and politics. She has served in a large number of advisory and policymaking positions for national and state government, including as chairman of the External Advisory Board for the Central Intelligence Agency, as chairman of the American Conservative Union Foundation, as chairman of Good 360, and as chairman of Opportunity International. Carly Fiorina's extensive biography and lifetime of experiences has taught her that the highest calling of leadership is to unlock the potential of others, and we are delighted to have her here to share her wisdom with us tonight. At the end, we will have time for questions, so please raise your hand and we'll pass you a mic. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ms. Carly Fiorina.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening. You know, after that extensive introduction, I feel that my first job is to correct the record. So I want to start, this won't take too long, don't worry. I want to start when I was 17. I was 17, and my dearest desire, my greatest hope, was to be matriculated at Yale University. Seriously, I was rejected. I was devastated. I was desolated. Oh my gosh, I didn't get into Yale. And so the first thing I want to say to you tonight is if you have a bad day, and let's face it, we all do, if one of these days you're hanging around Yale and you think, oh gosh, why am I here? What am I doing? Just know that there are kids all over the country who desperately want to be where you are. And I was one of them all those many years ago. I went on to Stanford. That suited me fine. I graduated from Stanford with, but I really wanted to go to Yale. I graduated from Stanford with a degree in medieval history and philosophy. So I was highly educated. I would recommend the study of history and philosophy and music and art to anyone because it feeds the soul and it gives you perspective. But graduating from Stanford with a degree in medieval history and philosophy in the middle of a deep recession at the late 70s, I was all dressed up and nowhere to go. I was unemployable. And so I went off to law school because that's what my parents wanted me to do. I was kind of a goody two-shoes middle child. I didn't really have a lot of courage or imagination, I think, at that age. And they thought I should go to law school, so I went. I hated law school, hated it. And in what was probably the first adult decision of my life, and certainly the most difficult decision of my then young life, I quit law school. I had the presence of mind to quit before the very first exam. But now my resume reads medieval history, philosophy, law school dropout. I'm really unemployable, and so I go to work full-time doing what I had done part-time to put myself through Stanford. Stanford, like Yale, is a very expensive school, and my parents couldn't afford it. So I was what they used to call in the old days a Kelly girl. Now, Kelly girl is politically incorrect today. We call them Kelly temporary personnel. But back then, we were mostly women who went into offices and typed and filed and answered the phones. I know that you are of an age, most of you, where you don't know what typing is, actually. It's keyboarding now, and what the heck are you filing in except in your email? And yes, we did, in fact, answer the phones. But that's what I did to help put myself through school. And so now I went back to work full-time as a secretary. I sat in a little kind of small building, one story. It was a 9-person real estate firm, and I answered the phones. And I typed, and I filed paperwork. I didn't think the job was beneath me. I was fortunate, I felt, to have a job. And about 6 months into that job, somebody came up to me, actually 2 men who worked in that office came up to me and said, "We've been watching you, and we think you could do more than type and file. Do you want to know what we do?" That was my introduction to business. More than that, it was my introduction to a very important aspect of leadership, which I'll come to in a moment, which is leaders see possibilities. And in particular, leaders see possibilities in people. And those 2 men saw possibilities in me. There was no reason they needed to, but they did. And because they saw possibilities in me, I saw possibilities in myself that I didn't know were there before. I ran away to Italy to teach English. My parents were quite concerned at this point, but eventually I settled down and got an MBA, and I landed eventually in AT&T. Not the AT&T you know today, but the AT&T of a couple decades ago. The Bell system, it had 1 million employees in it, and I was an entry-level salesperson. I was a nobody. I had no plans to move up the corporate ladder. Frankly, I was trying not to get fired every day. My very first meeting, this was a different time, a different era. There weren't many young women doing what I was doing. But my very first meeting with a client was in a strip club in downtown Washington, D.C. It was in a strip club because I worked with male colleagues, and they were used to going to the strip club. They weren't trying to be bad or mean or anything. It's just what they did. And they said, if you want to do what we do, you got to go where we go, and this is where we go. So I went to the strip club to meet our clients. I can tell you I felt like a fool. I looked like a fool, but they never did that to me again. Now, when you listen to a resume, like the very gracious introduction I got, and thank you, it sort of sounds smooth, doesn't it? Oh, you know, she started as a secretary, eventually she became a CEO. Life isn't like that. My life hasn't been like that. The meeting in the strip club was hard. We all have hard things that happen to us. But I want to tell you what I've learned along the way. I was never a politically active person. In fact, for most of my life, I didn't vote. I didn't start voting regularly till I was long past your age, well into my 30s. In fact, even my 40s. And so my political views haven't been formed by partisan politics. They've just been formed by my experience in life. I learned 3 very important things in the process of living life and going to work every day. The first thing I learned is that everybody, literally everybody, has more potential than they realize. I certainly did. But I'm not the only person I learned had more potential. I could tell you so many stories of the people I have met along the way. I could tell you the story of Jim. Jim was one of my very first subordinates when I became a boss for the first time. He was an engineer. He was one of these guys that stuck to his cubicle. He didn't say much. Nobody paid much attention to him. He just sat in his cubicle and he did his job all day long. And his job way back then was to design circuits. And when I became his boss, I didn't really understand much about what he did. And so I went over to his desk one day and I said, Jim, tell me about what you do. Tell me about your day. And in the course of that conversation, he said to me, you know, Carly, I design circuits all day long. And then we get billed for those circuits. And I've noticed that the bills we get and pay don't match the designs. Interesting idea. And so I told Jim, why don't you pursue that idea? And Jim ended up saving us $300 million in a single year. Jim had more potential than he realized. It's just that nobody had bothered to figure out what his potential was until a question got asked. I could tell you about Deborah. Deborah was an African-American single mom. Let me tell you, when you were an African-American single mom in corporate America in the 80s, it's tough. It was really tough. But Deborah was tough. And a lot of people overlooked Deborah. But what I saw in Deborah was somebody who was tough and resilient and understood what needed to be done. And so I turned Deborah into one of the lead negotiators for my team. She was a superb negotiator because she knew what she needed and she wasn't afraid to walk away from the table. And nobody could BS Deborah because she had heard it all. I could tell you about Bill, one of the first openly gay men that I knew serving in corporate America. The corporation, I will tell you, didn't know what to do with him. He was really smart, he was good at what he did, but they were a little nervous to put him in front of customers. And so they kept him off in service. You know, he'd get on the phone, but he actually wouldn't go out and talk to clients. But that isn't who Bill was. Bill was meant to be in sales. Bill was a client guy. He was witty, he was engaging, he was aggressive. So we turned Bill into a sales guy, and after a while, people stopped talking about Bill the gay guy and started talking about Bill the sales guy. I could tell you about a woman I met in India. A couple years ago, I had the great privilege of being the chairman of an organization called Opportunity International. Opportunity International is the largest private microfinance organization in the world. Microfinance is the process, you may know, of lending very small amounts of money to very poor people. What I've learned all around the world is people are not poor because they lack potential. They are frequently poor because nobody will take a chance on them, because they don't have opportunity or tools or education. And so microfinance is the process of giving poor people a loan. Imagine how difficult it would be to get ahead if you can't get a loan for anything. You're literally stuck living hand to mouth. And so Opportunity International has lent literally $8 billion, $100 at a time. And so one day, after a board meeting in New Delhi, India, I traveled to the slums. And I traveled to the slums of New Delhi because I wanted to meet some of our clients, some of these marvelous people who'd been given $100 and built something out of it. And I have to tell you, I had to climb a rickety ladder to get to the top of a roof to sit down with our clients. And I was steeling myself, because the slums of New Delhi are desperate places. Mountains of trash, marauding animals, sewage in the streets, people piled on top of each other, and I was preparing myself to see desperation in these women's eyes because their circumstances were desperate. But it isn't what I saw. I saw focus, I saw pride, I saw hope, I saw determination. Because, of course, we had done more than give them $100. We had done more than give them a helping hand. We had done more than train them how to become an entrepreneur, although we had done all those things. The most important thing we had said to them was, you have potential, you have possibilities, you have what my mother used to call God-given gifts. And with a helping hand and someone who will take a chance on you, you can build a life, a better life of dignity and purpose. I remember one client in particular, she told me she came from a very traditional family. Women weren't supposed to take loans. They weren't supposed to build businesses. They were supposed to stay home and take care of their husbands. And she said, my husband was very against me taking this loan. My in-laws were very against it. But finally, this woman got the courage to take that loan. And I asked her through an interpreter, well, how does your family feel about this now? And she said, they're happy they work for me. She had far more potential than she realized. Everyone has more potential than they realize. Not everyone has the opportunity, the tools, the chance to find and use their potential, but we all have it. The second thing I've learned over and over and over and over again is that people who are impacted by a problem actually do understand how to solve it. Now, they don't always get the chance to solve it. They're not always asked to solve it. They're not always given the resources or the opportunity to solve it, but they know. People sometimes ask me, how did I go from being a secretary to a CEO? I didn't have a plan. That wasn't my ambition. But everywhere I went, I found festering problems that had been left there. Everybody knew they were there. Everybody worked around them endlessly. You have problems here at Yale. You know what they are. And most of the time, people kind of talk about them, but somehow they never get solved. That happens in Washington a lot, too, right? We talk, nothing seems to get solved. In any event, I found festering problems everywhere. And when I would ask people who were impacted by the problem, what do you think? They always had good ideas. It's just no one had ever asked them. And so we solved problems. Together, we solved problems. At first, little problems. And then bigger problems. And when you solve problems, people notice. And the third thing I've learned is this. When you take a lot of power or a lot of money or a lot of decision making and you concentrate it in a few hands for too long, the power is abused. I learned it first in corporate bureaucracies. Power gets abused in university hierarchies, it gets abused in boardrooms, it gets abused in committee rooms in Washington. You concentrate too much power for too long in too few hands, the power will be abused. It is human nature. And the money will get wasted, and the decisions will be wrong. That's what I've learned in the course of my life. Now, it just happens to be that I think those same lessons about life are at the core of this country. If everyone has more potential than they realize, and by the way, talent is evenly spread all throughout the world. We don't have a monopoly on talent. Americans aren't smarter or better than anyone else. People who come here aren't smarter or better than anyone else. There's talent and gifts and potential all over the world. So it is worth asking, why is it that more things have been more possible for more people from more places here than anywhere else on earth? And it is indisputably true that more things have been more possible for more people from more places here than anywhere else on earth. We are not a perfect nation, but we have been a nation of possibilities. And I believe the reason more things have been more possible for more people here is because this is the only country on earth founded on an idea, the idea being that people are not defined by their circumstances or their parentage or their last name. Now, we have had to work very hard to make sure that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are a right for everyone, regardless of what they look like or where they come from. And we still have a long ways to go in that regard, in many ways. But it is also true that this is the only country on earth that was founded on that ideal, that everybody has a right that doesn't come from government. Everyone has a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I think that was an old-fashioned way of saying to fulfill your potential, to find and use your gifts, to figure out your way in life. And it also is the only country that said it shouldn't matter where you come from, and it shouldn't matter what your circumstances are. That is a unique idea in history. The other thing that's unique about this country is our Constitution was put together in such a way that we actually believe problems should be solved locally whenever possible. There are certain problems that have to be solved by the federal government, but there are a whole lot of problems that really shouldn't be solved by the federal government. And when the federal government tries, it generally speaking mucks it up. And we have loads of examples of that. That's not a partisan comment, it's a factual comment. And so much of our Constitution focuses on what should get done locally and what should get done federally. And it is also why so much of our Constitution is all about preventing the concentration of power. So much of our Constitution says don't put too much money or too much power in one place. George Washington gave a farewell address to the nation. And in that farewell address, he warned us about the rise of political parties. He said, it was September, I think, 1790-something. I was a medieval history major, not an American history major. But in any event, it was a long time ago, and it was in September. And in that speech, if you go back and read the text, what you'll find he said was, beware the rise of political parties. Because political parties will come to care only about winning. And they will forget about governing and values and solving problems. And I think, ladies and gentlemen, that is a bipartisan affliction. Politicians on both sides of the aisle are consumed with winning, but they are not so focused on problem solving. And we have a lot of problems. And Americans, whether you're Democrats or independents or Republicans, young, old, men, women, what all the data says is that Americans think now, 80% of us think now, that the federal government has grown incompetent and corrupt, and that politicians are in it for themselves, that they're in it for their perks, their position, their power, their title. They're not in it to solve problems. And it's why I think there's so much frustration and angst. So I want to talk about problem solving for a moment, because I think problem solving is what most of us expect out of people we look up to, but it's also a capacity that each of us have. Here's the thing about problem solving. I said that I believe, based on experience, lots of experience, that people are actually capable of figuring out how to solve a problem that impacts them. And I've also said that everybody has more potential than they realize, particularly to make their situation better if given the chance to do so. So why do problems fester? Well, I'll tell you why. And you actually know why. Because the status quo, whatever it is very powerful. Whatever the status quo is, even if it's incredibly unsatisfactory, the status quo has enormous power. And the reason the status quo always has power in a society, in a community, in a family, in a company, in a nation, is because there are people who are invested in the status quo. They have succeeded in the status quo. And people want to keep what they have. They want to keep what they know. It doesn't make them bad people, it makes them human. And so frequently you will see people who would rather sit with a status quo that is unsatisfying because they're afraid of the unknown out there, or because maybe it's better over here, but boy, I don't want to let go of what I got. So the status quo has enormous power. And it is in any status quo that problems fester. And so what's the secret sauce? What's the catalyst to solve a problem and overcome the status quo? Leadership. Leadership. The purpose of leadership is to challenge the status quo. That is its purpose. And its payoff, the payoff of any leader, whether it's the woman in the slums of New Delhi or Deborah Hughes as a negotiator, the purpose of leadership is to solve problems. The price of leadership is always criticism. Always. Because it's tough to tackle the status quo. And whatever it is, you're going to get criticized. You can't do that. We've never tried that. Are you crazy? Criticism is the price. Now let me say for a moment, if leadership is problem solving, what isn't leadership? I'll tell you what leadership isn't. It isn't title. It isn't position. It isn't how big your office is. That's what I used to think. And I think we're very confused about leadership these days because our politics are filled with people who aren't leading. We've got lots of people with big titles who aren't leading. Our culture doesn't really celebrate leadership. It celebrates rude, crude, outrage, sex, and violence. Leadership is not about position and title. When I was that young woman a long time ago, I thought the leader was the person in the corner office. The person with the big title, the person who had the best parking space, the person who had the biggest budget, the person who had the most people reporting to them. And then I got a little older and wiser, and I learned that there were people with big offices and big titles who were not leading. They were not solving problems, they were not challenging the status quo, and they were most definitely not serving others. Leadership is not about position and title. Leadership is also not the same as management. Management's important. And managers can be leaders and leaders can be managers, but they're not the same thing. Managers are people who do the best they can within existing constraints and conditions. In other words, managers do the best they can within the status quo, but they do not challenge it. A leader challenges it. Because the only way you solve a festering problem is to challenge the way things are. So if leadership isn't about position and title, who's a leader? So I talked about how all of us have more potential than we realize. What I know is everyone has the potential to lead. Everyone has the potential to lead. Not everyone chooses to do so, but everyone can. Because the fundamentals of leadership are human. And I want to talk about 4 of them. Yes, leaders need particular skills in certain disciplines. But there are 4 fundamental characteristics that define a leader. And they are available to all of us. The first is courage. It takes courage to challenge the status quo. It takes courage to say, you know what? This isn't good enough anymore. This isn't fair anymore. We can do better now. It takes courage. And it takes courage because every time you say one of those things, somebody's going to try and cut you down. Somebody's going to tell you you're wrong. Leadership takes character. Character is an old-fashioned word. We don't talk much about character anymore. And maybe it's because we don't have all that many great examples of character. But character is knowing that how you do things is as important as what you do. Character is knowing that the ends don't justify every means. Character is knowing the difference between a short-term win and a long-term gain. Character is sticking to what you think is true north when everybody is telling you to turn west. Leadership takes character. Leadership also takes collaboration. You cannot solve a problem unless you collaborate with others. And in particular, you cannot usually solve a problem unless you're prepared to collaborate with people who are different than you are. Here's the thing about all of us. We're not bad, we're human. All of us are more comfortable with people like us. All of us are more comfortable with people that look like us, who've had the same experience as us, who sound like us, who like the same things as us. And so if left to our own devices, most of us will drift off and be with people like us. It's easier, it's more comfortable, but guess what? Problems usually don't get solved that way, particularly in our society. The only way problems get solved is if people actually can collaborate with each other despite their differences. Find common ground doesn't mean losing your principles. One of my principles is everybody has potential, and so I will write off no one. But collaboration, nonetheless, is a search for common ground around what is the problem, actually, and can we agree on a solution. Here's the thing about collaboration. It takes humility. It takes humility, because in order to collaborate with somebody else, you have to actually be humble enough to say, I don't have all the answers. I don't know. I need help. It takes humility to actually be prepared to listen to somebody else. It also takes empathy. What is empathy? Empathy is the ability to actually see someone else. Empathy is the ability to hear someone else. Empathy is the ability to say, you know, I have a lot of resentments and grievances and tough times of my own. But this person also has resentments and grievances and has had tough times too. The most important quality of all, though, I think, of a leader. I was asked the other day if I only had to pick one thing, one quality that I would look for in somebody that I would hire or work with, what would that one quality be? And I said if I had only one thing to pick, I would choose someone who sees possibilities. In my experience, you run across kind of two kinds of people. There are people, and you know both of these kinds of people. There are people who walk into a situation, perhaps it's a class or a job or a problem. They walk into a situation and they say, well, we can't do this. We better not try that. They're never going to let me do this. These are people who see a set of circumstances and immediately see the limitations, the constraints, the what they can't get done. And then there are people who will walk into exactly the same set of circumstances, exactly the same, and say, I could do this. I could take that loan. I could solve that problem. They've never tried that. What if we went this way? Those are people who see possibilities. You cannot solve problems unless you can see possibilities. Another word for that is optimism, good old-fashioned optimism. In order to solve a problem, let me tell you, and you know this, you have to be clear-eyed and realistic about what that problem is. You have to really understand all the aspects of that problem. But without optimism, you can never solve that problem. Because optimism is the ability to see that things can be better. A leader sees possibilities. And in particular, a leader sees possibilities in the people around them and sees that in every circumstance there are people with potential who, if properly motivated and have the right opportunities and tools and can be lifted up, can make progress against that problem. Everybody has the capacity to lead, because all of us are capable of courage. All of us are capable of character, even in very tough times. All of us are capable of reaching out to people who are different than we are and collaborating with them in a spirit of humility and empathy and mutual respect. And each of us can decide to see possibilities, particularly in others. What's my definition of leadership? The highest calling of a leader is to unlock potential in others so that festering problems can be solved. And I believe leadership is a choice. In the end, it is a choice. This is a nation that believes in possibilities. And wherever you have come from, and whatever the difficult times in your life are or have been or will be, and I too have known difficult times, personally and professionally. Whatever those tough times are, know this: you have so much more potential than you know. You can choose to lead. And in this nation, despite all our problems, despite our less than perfect history, in this nation, we believe in possibilities. And in this nation, we know that no one should be defined by their circumstances, by what they look like, how they start, or where they come from. Instead, we should be defined by our God-given gifts, the opportunities that we take advantage of, and the possibilities that we can create. Thank you so much. I'll be happy to take your questions.
Okay, we're going to do questions now, so just raise your hands and we'll come along the aisles to hand you microphones. Any first?
Thank you very much for speaking to us tonight. I'm a student at the School of Management, and prior to coming here, I've spent numerous years overseas, serving as well as working. And I wanted to get your thoughts because coming back, I see a lot of anger in my society, in my community. And I was wondering, what's your take on empowering young people to be leaders, to be able to take control of that anger and make something more positive through that? The economics don't seem to be working our way. Big cities are getting richer. A lot of small cities where I came from are dying. And, we're not getting healthier either as a population. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on.
Well, first, I agree with you. There is a lot of anger. And I think first, that anger comes from the reality that for many people, their lives are not getting better. Second, I think anger comes from frustration that, things that problems we thought should have been solved aren't getting solved. And problems that we didn't even know were there are suddenly there. I mean, of course people are angry when their water is poisoned in Flint. I mean, you could go on and on. Of course our daughter died of addictions. And so I personally really understand it when families are so angry. How can it be that we have an opioid crisis in this country with prescription drugs flowing all over the country? I battled cancer, so I've been through a lot of surgeries. And I get angry thinking, boy, every time I had a surgery, I got a bottle of pills this big. And I took 2, and then I had a bottle of pills. Man, I could have gone into the drug business. I guess a lot of people do. Of course people are angry because they see a set of circumstances that aren't getting better. But I also think this, and this is where I think George Washington had it so right when he said, beware the rise of political parties. Our politics fuels that anger. If you think about our political dialogue, and sadly, it is both Democrats and Republicans, our political discourse is all about what? Resentment, grievance, victimization. Who's more mad? You're mad about taking the knee, I'm mad. I mean, whoa, it gets really fired up. Why does that happen? I've asked myself over the years, why does that happen? Why is our politics focused on fueling anger? And it is. You know why? Because it raises money. And it gets the vote out. I'm sorry. I know that sounds cynical and terrible, but parties will get focused on winning. In order to win, you need to raise money and you need to get your base out to vote. And so politics is focused on winning. And to raise a lot of money, what do? You tell people, get mad. What about whatever it is? I mean, pick your issue, get mad about it. And get mad about it, and the only way it's going to get solved is if you send me back to wherever. Congress, not hell in this case, but maybe Congress is hell right now, I don't know. Point is, it's all about the cycle of winning. I ran for office both times, and I will do so again if I choose to do so again, because I believe in citizen government. And ultimately, citizens are going to have to take hold of this government and our political process. And so all the way back, it is citizens who are going to have to stand up and say, you know what, we can't keep just sending our problems to Washington because they're not getting fixed there. And if we continue to believe that politicians are going to solve our problems for us, guess what? They're not. You're in the School of Management. You know, in management, empirical evidence matters. We have loads of evidence, folks. And that's not a partisan comment either. Washington has been getting bigger and richer and more powerful under Republicans and Democrats alike for 60 years because politicians like what they got, but it isn't helping us. And so what I would encourage you to do, I don't know your particular community, I don't know your particular ambitions, but what I know is this: when you finish at the School of Management at Yale University, you have a set of insights and skills and capabilities that can make all the difference in the world wherever you choose to place them. And so, place them somewhere where they can make a difference. And have the courage and the character and the humility and the empathy to see the possibilities and help solve a problem. Right here. Sorry. You can go back to the lady if she was. Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
You mentioned that optimism is a key aspect of leadership. As a leader, how do you balance the internal optimism with realism to guide a team towards your overall goal through treacherous territory?
That's a great question. How do you balance optimism and realism? So one of the things I like to say is balance is the art of leadership, because there are many things that have to be balanced to lead. Optimism and realism, short-term and long-term, in a business setting, profit and growth. But how do you balance, to your very specific question? First, I have a technique that I use. I've used it in every setting: charitable settings, business settings, political settings. In order to be realistic, you have to clearly understand where are you, what I would call your current state. One of the roles a leader has, I believe, is to hold the mirror up and ask a team to look in the mirror, see the truth, speak the truth, act on the truth. That is actually harder to do than you might imagine. Because what people want to do when you say, well, what's your current state? What are things like right now? People maybe are going to kind of not tell the whole truth, gild the lily. And so you have to really get clear. What is our current state? How bad is it really? You have to know that in detail. Then, and only then, can you start talking about the future state. But what could we do? Where could we go? How much better could this be? And generally speaking, what you'll find out is when people start to compare in a disciplined way, where are we now? Let's get real. Let's get real. Where are we now? Washington, D.C. spends a ton of money and doesn't solve any problems. Where do we want to be? I think where they have a lot less money and a lot less power and we're solving more problems. But when you get disciplined about that comparison, people start to think up solutions. And then you have to track your progress along the way. So you're right. Balancing those two is critical. And if you start out trying to solve a problem by not seeing the whole problem, you'll never solve it.
Thank you. So we can see from the failed election of Senator Luther Strange, as well as the failed repeal attempts, that the Republican establishment and the party body as a whole is not currently really able to enact its agendas. Using your conception of leadership and the principles behind that leadership, what's a framework for getting sort of back on track?
Well, you know, let's talk about what we were just chatting about here, current state, future state. My advice to the Republican Party on this whole repeal and replace is first of all, let me back up. I believe it was a critical mistake for Democrats to pass Obamacare on a purely partisan vote. because it undermined support for that bill the second it passed. Never mind the problems with the bill itself. How you get things done is as important as what you get done. And a leader understands if you're going to have a sustainable solution, you better have support. But Republicans went off and did exactly the same thing. They made exactly the same mistake. We're just going to go past this thing on a partisan basis. So what does that set up immediately? It sets up a set of people who say we win and a set of people who say we lose, and that is not going to be a sustainable solution. And unfortunately, too many people, I think, in Washington thought about it as a political win instead of thinking about it as we're toying with people's lives. These are people's lives. I'm a cancer survivor. I'm a pre-existing condition. I've lost a child to addictions. These are people's lives. So, I think what Democrats, that's a long time ago, but now, what people in Washington need to do is stand up and take the time to get the American people to a common understanding of what's the problem. We don't even have a common understanding of what the problem is. If you go and listen to people talk about Obamacare, you'll have one set of people saying, this is the problem. You'll have another set of people saying, that's the problem. You would never attempt to solve a problem in business until everybody agreed what the problem was. That's one of the things politicians could learn from businesses. We don't have a common understanding of the problem. And so therefore, it's hopeless that we're going to come to common ground on the solution. But secondly, have the Republicans ever described their solution to the American people? I don't know what it is. I don't know what it is. When you have senators saying, I don't know what's in the bill, gee, that sounds familiar. Remember, sorry, Nancy Pelosi, we have to pass the bill to find out what's in it. Well, it's exactly the same thing when a Susan Collins or anybody else says, I don't actually know what's in this bill. If the senators on the floor don't know what's in the bill, you can bet your life the American people don't know what's in the bill. And so therefore, how can they support it? See, I think we need an understanding of what the problem is, a common understanding. I think politicians spend way too much time talking to themselves and not enough time talking to the American people. And I have become convinced that if we want to actually reform our political system, what it's going to take is more active citizens and more leaders stepping up and saying, I will stay engaged in this. You don't have to run for office, but you got to keep the pressure on. So, I'd love to have a solution to Obamacare because it's not working for too many people. But right now, I do not think the American people have a common view of the problem, and they certainly don't have a common view of the solution because the solution has never been explained to them. And these are people's lives.
Thank you very much for speaking to us. So you mentioned that you found the political party system inherently problematic. With regards to how politics is going in Washington. With that in mind, would you advocate for some kind of radical restructuring of the modern party system or for some kind of decentralization away from Washington?
Yeah. So, never say never, but right now I think it's hard to imagine a radical restructuring of the two-party system in this country. Why? Because all the money and power and infrastructure is in this two-party system. And both parties, money and power is focused on returning incumbents. It's not to say they don't welcome other people to the table, but if you look at where the money goes, it's true of Republicans and Democrats, it's about returning incumbents. Why has gerrymandering of districts occurred? By both parties. Why do we only have 7% of the districts in this country that are actually competitive? Because both parties engaged in this game where let's draw districts so we don't have to fight real hard. We know we're going to keep it. That's about winning, running and winning, running and winning. That's not the same as problem solving. So I think it's hard to imagine a radical restructuring of that system. What I think must happen, and the standard by which I judge any administration, Republican or Democrat, is this. Does money move out of Washington? Does power move out of Washington? Does decision-making move out of Washington? And if it does, that is progress in the right direction. And if it doesn't, if it continues to be concentrated, which is what is going on right now, then citizens will not have a powerful enough voice. But I also think that we as citizens have to stop saying, that's not my problem, that's the government's problem. I will tell you, I said that I wasn't particularly politically active for much of my business career. I wasn't. I kind of went around like this. That's not my lane. Oh, you know, that's politics. I mean, some people love politics, but I didn't particularly, not my lane. I'm going to stay in my lane. I'm going to do my thing. The thing is, the country is our lane. And this was intended to be a citizen government. And unless citizens, whether you belong to a political group or not, unless citizens decide this is power concentrated, power abused, and we have to take more ownership for solving the problems that we face in our communities, I don't think we're going to get there. It's why a lot of what I'm doing today is focusing on leadership development for nonprofits, community-based nonprofits around this country. Because nonprofits in this country, civil society, if you will, to use an old-fashioned term, faith-based organization, nonprofits, they are dealing with incredibly difficult problems. And they frequently are not invested in. And what they need more of is leadership capacity. And so we're investing in that so that they can tackle more successfully the desperate problems they face every day. Yes?
Thank you. You mentioned, due to your proximity, I guess, to the opiate issue in the country, I'm wondering if you could talk about that more so about, like, well, first of all, the causes of the epidemic itself, and then possible methods to address it. And then kind of related to that, as we've been talking about so far, the issues about the financial incentives in government, like, kind of taking over, like the incentives of the people. How do you remove financial incentives, like through lobbying or whatever, from the government when the only people who can remove those incentives are the government itself? And I believe your answer to this is, like, more engaged citizens. So if so, how do we create more engaged citizens?
So first, with regard to the opioid crisis, this is an interesting example of the role the federal government can play and the role that local communities can play. And there's an important role for both. So here are things, for example, that only the federal government can do. Only the federal government, only the Congress can pass criminal justice reform. Criminal justice reform is incredibly important. Addicts are not criminals. They're addicts. And so I can remember standing in front of a judge, begging him not to send our daughter back to jail. She wasn't a criminal, and I knew it wouldn't help her, but his hands were tied. So criminal justice reform is something only the federal government can do. Here's another thing only the federal government can do. The federal government needs to reform HIPAA laws. HIPAA laws were drafted originally to protect patients' privacy. But like so many things, they had unintended consequences. And the unintended consequence of the HIPAA laws is that a patient is cut off from their family, from their community, from their church perhaps, or their synagogue, or their place of worship. And so I can remember desperately talking to doctors, but they couldn't talk to me because, as is so often the case, an addict will cut themselves off. And finally we found a doctor who said, I cannot talk to you, but I can listen to you. Tell me what I need to know about your daughter. Only the federal government can reform the HIPAA laws. On the other hand, what can happen in a community? We know what works. We know what programs work. It doesn't mean it works for everyone. Sadly, it didn't work for our daughter, but it works for a lot of people. We know that it starts with prevention. We know that once somebody is rehabilitated, they need to be returned and restored to a community, and so the best programs are community-based. And those community-based programs need more resources, not fewer. So when we're spending more money in Washington, D.C. on some big program, it isn't helping. It isn't helping the person in New Hampshire or the person in Appalachia. I've been to both of those places, and they are desperate for the resources to make the programs they know work. So that would be an example of knowing who should do what. With regard to your question about money and power, yes, citizens need to be more engaged, but here's some obvious things that could help. Take money and power out of Washington. Today, tax reform is on the table right now. My test for tax reform is, does it make it simpler, yes, cutting tax rates is important, but simplicity is incredibly important. Why? I should back up. My dad was a professor of tax law. And I used to say to my father, I adored my father, but I thought, tax law, oh my God, how boring. Daddy, how can you possibly like this? And I remember he would say to me, Carly, the tax code is how government exercises power. And boy, is that true. We have a 76,000-page tax code. Now, guess who that tax code benefits? Hewlett-Packard. Guess what? As the CEO of Hewlett-Packard, I could hire accountants and lawyers all day long. But the little 9-person real estate business can't hire anybody. So the tax code benefits big business over little business. The complexity of the tax code always benefits the wealthy. Why? Because the wealthy can hire the accountants and lawyers to figure out all the loopholes and the special gimmicks in that 76,000 pages. And the normal family, I mean, I don't know what's in my tax return half the time. Most Americans don't. Complexity favors the rich. Complexity favors the big. Complexity favors the powerful and the well-connected always. It is the complexity of Washington that gives it power. And so the most important thing, I think, is to vastly simplify the tax code. My formula: lower every rate, close every loophole. Close every loophole. Because the thing is, yes, there are some loopholes that are really important, charitable deductions, incredibly important, but what about the 75,000 other pages? That would help. Simplicity favors the well-connected and the wealthy. The lady in the back there.
Sorry, I have it.
Uh-oh, it's written. That's always bad.
No, no, I just forget things. Well, first I wanted to thank you for speaking to us tonight. You mentioned that this nation recognizes the potential and possibility of everyone, no matter where they come from and what they look like. Do you believe the current administration reflects this national sentiment, specifically in regard to the recent travel bans?
Yeah. Yes and no is my honest answer. No, in the sense that I think we are sending a message to the world that we are not welcoming. And I think that's a problem, because this is a nation that was built by immigrants. This is a nation whose self-interest demands. If we want to be the greatest nation in the world, now and in the future, we must always be the place where people say, I want to go there. I want to go there. And we must welcome people who want to come here. However, that's the no part. Here's the yes part. There is no other country on earth that has been this lax with its borders. It is fundamental to say we have to have a secure border. I will tell you, I remember a very poignant example. Do you remember a couple summers ago, all these unaccompanied children streamed across the border? Oh my God, it's heartbreaking. Think of the desperation the parents must have felt to send their children unaccompanied on a long journey in the hands of human traffickers across a border. Think of the desperation those parents must have felt. And our hearts broke. And yet I remember talking to a woman in New Hampshire, and in a little town in New Hampshire, a town struggling, and she said, we can't even take care of our own children. How are we going to take care of these children? And that little community was being forced by the federal government to accept thousands of those children. And so I can see how people get angry about that. So we have to secure borders. I think, personally, I think a wall will never happen, and I think it's a ridiculous idea. But I do think we need to know who's coming into this country, and we need to know why, and we have to thoroughly vet them. And there is no excuse in this day and age of technology for us to have people coming into this country, and oops, it turns out they've been trafficking in terrorist rhetoric long before they got here. There's no excuse. I can figure out who my granddaughter's dating on Facebook. We can figure out We can figure out what you're doing on Facebook. And by the way, folks, social media is called social media because it's social. It's not private property. So, we got to have a secure border. We got to know who's coming in and out. But this has to be a nation that welcomes people who want a better life for themselves and their families always. It has made us a nation of possibilities.
We have time for one last question.
And I think it's, okay. It's the lady in the back. Sorry, sir. You were real close.
Thank you for coming to talk to us. I'm starting to volunteer with a nonprofit board, and I'm someone who definitely sees a lot of possibilities and improvement in what we're trying to achieve, but a lot of the other members like to complain about the status quo, but sort of stick with the status quo. So what sort of suggestions do you have for, trying to change that mindset, trying to, encourage those around you to get to more of the mindset that you talked about? Thanks.
Well, that's so typical of lots of teams and lots of boards, and maybe at this point you're feeling that, feeling when you're like, come on, team, and everybody's like, oh, who got her on this board? Please, just look, a lot of people are comfortable in the status quo. It's just true. So my advice to you would be this. Look for your change warriors, and I'll explain what I mean by that. There are three kinds of people on any team. In any organization, there are three kinds of people. There are people that I call change warriors. These are people who get it. They want to solve problems. I call them, sometimes you'll hear the phrase change agent. Agent isn't nearly strong enough. To make change, you got to be a warrior in addition to a leader. But there are people who get it, they're with you, they want to change. Find them. They may be on the board, they may be in the organization, find them. And they're not necessarily who you might expect. Some people will say, well, the change warriors, they can't be the old guys. Frequently they are the old guys. Sometimes they're not the young ones. So don't be confused by how people look. Look for the people who ask the tough questions. Look for people who say, but what if we did this? Find your change warriors. The good news is they are always there. The bad news is they're usually about 20% of the people at first. There's another group of people, and you need to know who these people are too. These are the people I call, hell no, I won't go. They are not going. They are planted. They like it the way it is. They're going to defend the way it is. They're not moving. And they are sometimes hard to discern because these are people who, to use a crude expression, I know you use it all the time, but these are people who suck up really well. Great idea. So glad you're on the board. What a great idea. Go do that. I'm right behind you. And what they're really doing, as soon as you leave the room, is we're not doing that. Hell no, I won't go. These are resistors, and they will get in your way. The good news is they're only 20% of the people. The bad news is they're always there. And then there's everyone else. 20% plus 20%, that's 40%. You got 60% of the people left. And what are 60% of the people? What are the vast majority of people? They're skeptics. They're bystanders. They're waiting to see who's going to win this battle. And so the only way change happens, the only way a leader actually makes progress is the change warriors help them move the skeptics. You don't need unanimity to make change. You do need critical mass. The skeptics have to start to move. And the way the skeptics are moved is by the people they know who are change warriors telling them, it's okay, this is going to work. So maybe it's not you saying to some skeptic on the board, because maybe you're new and you don't have the relationship. Maybe it's somebody they know that you've figured out as a change warrior saying, you know what, we actually can go here. This current state, it's really pretty lousy. We can get here. We can make progress. And then, as a change warrior, you got to give the skeptics hope, which means you have to measure your progress and you have to tell people when things are getting better. And when you have a setback, you got to own up to it and say, yep, that's a setback. It's a mistake. We screwed up. You can't hide that. But you have to keep showing them progress and never, ever let people forget, where are we going and why? Where are we going and why? You never can do it on your own, so find the people who will help you. I've really enjoyed being with you tonight, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for having me. If I can just say one last thing. As you, especially to the students here, as you go out in life, you will have good times and you will have tough times. Know that in the tough times sometimes come the best lessons. And know as well that wherever you go, there are going to be people who lift you up, and there are going to be people who tear you down. It is part of life. Look for the people who lift you up. And don't let the people who tear you down get in your head, especially don't let them get in your heart, and don't let them get under your skin. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.